He was mayor of Todd Mission, is the little town of 113 people. George Cullum was mayor of that town. I think he was the only mayor of that town. I believe the town was incorporated for the sole purpose of the Texas Renaissance Festival. The idea being, gosh, he's part of a lawsuit and now he's found dead. So there's a little bit of rumor mills going about causes of the death. Welcome to episode 71 of the Weekly Docket, the Silberman Law Firm podcast. Today is May 22nd, 2025. I'm your host, Bill Silberman, and owner of the firm, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Heald, who's our supervising attorney and our resident expert in probate and all things litigation. Chris, have you looked at the show outline today?
I have not.
All right, we're just keeping it real then, but you're so good you're able to do these shows without even looking at the outline. That's just how we roll. But all right, this is what's on the docket today, Chris. We've got an update on this Texas Renaissance Festival story. This is the one where a judge ordered the owner of the Texas Renaissance Festival to sell the property because he signed a contract, decided he did not want to sell, and the plaintiff, the buyer, took him to court. Judge says, Renaissance Festival guy, you lose. Please sign over the property. And here's the spoiler alert. The update is that the owner of the Texas Renaissance Festival, George Cullum, was found dead in his house. That's the update. And then from there, we're talking about one big, beautiful bill. It's passed in the House, so it's going to go to the Senate. We're going to talk about what that means for you. Probably a lot less tax is the good news. And in our legal questions section, we're going to talk about small business LLCs and what happens when an owner dies. And then finally, we're going to be ranting and raving about car dealerships and deceptive practices. Much of that could be a whole show in itself, but we're going to limit that to the rant and rave section. So, good show today. Let's get it kicked off with our legal news section and talking about this Renaissance Festival owner. Chris, when I heard the news, I was a little bit sad. Were you sad?
Yeah, my wife told me, and so she was sad. Felt heartfelt condolences.
The guy's name was George Cullum, and I was sad at first, but then I learned he was 87 years old. Is it wrong to be less sad when an old person dies? Because if he were like 50 or 40, I'm like, gosh, that's tragic. But 87, maybe even 60, but 87, I'm kind of like, is that all?
I think that's human nature. I certainly do that. When I see the dates of somebody who passed, I always look to say, oh, how old were they? And it's always nice to be able to look and say, okay, he lived a full life, because it is sad when someone dies when they're in their 50s or 40s or something like that. Unfortunately for us, lots of lawyers do.
Yeah, a lot of lawyers, high-stress litigators, they have heart attacks in their 40s and 50s. So, Chris, don't be thinking about that, all right? That's not going to happen to you. But anyway, I'm not a callous jerk of an attorney for thinking that, hey, the guy was 87. Not that sad a story. But he did pass away. There's been some speculation that maybe it wasn't a natural death. That is, as far as I checked, I just checked before the show, nobody knows, cause of death unknown. Ongoing investigation. I guess the speculation of maybe it not being natural is associated with the timing. He was just part of this big lawsuit where he did not want to sell the property. He was mayor of Todd Mission, is the little town of 113 people. George Cullum was mayor of that town. I think he was the only mayor of that town. I believe the town was incorporated for the sole purpose of the Texas Renaissance Festival. The idea being, gosh, he's part of a lawsuit and now he's found dead. So there's a little bit of rumor mills going about on the causes of the death. We don't know yet. Ongoing investigation. We can talk a little bit about this from a legal perspective. So have you had any plaintiffs or defendants that have died in the midst of litigation before?
Plenty. I don't want to say plenty of times, but yeah, it certainly happens over the course of 16 years. It's happened to me several times. And even in estate litigation, when you're fighting over an estate and one of the parties fighting over a decedent's estate then dies, it does happen. I don't know if this was still ongoing litigation or if they had actually, it sounds like they had a final order. Maybe there's post-judgment stuff, maybe there's appeals, but I don't know where they are in the process there, but it sounds like this one may have been done.
Chris, does the term Scire Facias or whatever, it's the Latin term, Scire Facias,
Siri Facias.
Siri Facias, does that mean anything to you?
It does. And my phone just went off because it thinks it thinks I said, "Hey Siri."
Oh,
Well, the Siri Facias, and it is a way of telling one of the parties that, hey, the estate needs to appear. That just happened in a couple of our cases, actually, where our client was told, or a writ of Siri Facias was issued. And in the most recent case that I'm thinking of, we had a husband and wife couple that was part of the lawsuit. Wife died. So husband had to run over to probate court, get appointed as wife's administrator, come back to the district court, appear on her behalf so that the case could.
okay. So typically what happens if you're in the middle of a court case, you'll file a suggestion of death to the court, and then the court will typically this order saying that, hey, Mr. Executor Administrator, Siri Facias, writ of Siri Facias, as Chris is calling it, saying, Mr. Executor, Mr. Administrator of the estate, you're required to appear and make a defense. The deal with this Texas Renaissance Festival, it's a little interesting because the judgment was already issued by the district court, and it was a judgment to force the owner of the Texas Renaissance Festival, King George, to come forward and sign and complete the documents transferring the property to the plaintiff. How do you think that works, Chris? Do you think that the executor is going to be forced to do that? Is that how that's going to pan out?
Yeah, I think they're probably going to have to take their judgment over to probate court. If the executor doesn't want to comply, they may. Oftentimes children that come into this spot, or I'm assuming, I don't know if it's going to be a child or someone else, but whoever takes over the estate, if you already have a contract to sell, or in this case, an order to sell, probably easiest to just comply and get it done rather than continue litigation. So likely the plaintiff in that case will just go to the executor of the estate and say, hey, let's finish this up. We'll pay the money. You transfer the property. Let's get this done. But if everything were that simple, they wouldn't have people like us.
We were just talking before the show how difficult and stubborn people keep us employed. So that is very true for if you're a lawyer. But yeah, hopefully the administrator will just sign over the deed and there won't be a need to do a bunch of gyrations in the probate court. All right. Farewell to King George. I think his heirs, whoever they may be, or the beneficiaries of his will, are going to be paupers because I believe he was selling the property for $50 or $60 million. So they will be well cared for, and our condolences go out to the family, whoever they may be. That brings us to our next legal news topic, and this is one big, beautiful bill. We're going to pass one big, beautiful bill passed in the House last night. Chris, have you been following this at all? Actually, this morning, past 7 a.m. this morning or something, Eastern time. They had an all-nighter in the House. Have you been following it all, Chris, or am I going to educate you?
Not one bit. I make it a point not to follow, and I got to be honest with you, it's not that hard not to follow national politics. Well, actually have to follow it.
Well, you're right. You don't. It sounds like you're expressing a little bit of distaste for the political scene in Washington.
Yeah, it's all over dramatized. It's all a lot of inflammatory rhetoric. I just don't find it enjoyable. If I really want to find news, I can go to the financial pages, whether that be TV or internet. I find that to be the least biased or most fact-based. Even opinions sneak their way in there.
Yeah.
We all have opinions.
Well, this big, beautiful bill, Chris, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect a lot of people. So our job, our public service, is to break it down to the listeners and really just regular people that are going to hear these clips of our show on social media, to try to give them some basic information in 30 to 60 seconds is how that usually works on TikTok and YouTube. So big, beautiful bill passes in the House. For those who don't know, that means it still has to go to the Senate. The Senate will take a look at it. There'll be these amendments to the bill. Then it gets signed into law by the president. And the big hurdle passed by one vote in the House. And here's what it means for small business owners, for regular people. First of all, did you heard about the campaign promises that Trump made? No tax on tips and overtime. Did you hear about that at all, Chris?
Yeah, I do remember him saying that. I find it funny. I hear you using the rhetoric that I see on the headlines. Are they really campaign promises? Is that really what we call them? It's what presidents want, but
I
he
mean,
can't promise that. He doesn't have the power to promise it. I think it's just, hey, here's some things I'm gonna try to accomplish. But then the lay people say, oh, it was a promise. He better deliver. I think he promised a wall. Yeah.
Chris, if you ran for office, you would never be elected. I want you to know that. So
I
the way
will never run for office. You needn't worry.
the way this works, Chris, is you make a lot of promises and you don't. You're too much of a lawyer. All right, you're on the campaign trail and you say, if I win, I'll end the Russian-Ukrainian war in one day. Okay, if I win, you'll pay no tax on tips or overtime. You don't have all these little qualifying statements like, if I run for office and I win, then provided that Vladimir Putin is cooperative, I'll end the war. And you don't say that if I win, I will pressure Congress to pass legislation that exempts tips on overtime, but not all tips and overtime wages will be. So you don't go all that's you're not going to win an election doing that. But let's talk about no tax on tips, no tax on tips and overtime. When I first heard about it, my thought was immediately, Chris, we're going to start paying all of our lawyers hourly and we're going to let them work overtime. And we're going to basically equate that amount to a way that gives them this huge tax windfall. That was my initial thought. There are some smart people in Congress and they're not going to let that happen. This is hollow victory in many ways. It's a big victory if you're a politician because Trump delivers, the Republicans deliver. But Chris, you're not going to find this surprising. If you're waiting tables at Denny's, you already probably pay no tax, all right? Because most people in this country don't pay federal income tax. You have to make enough money to do that. And people that wait tables, they typically don't make a lot. So 40% of people making tips, like waitresses, they're already paying no tax. And this one only applies to the tax on federal income. You still have to pay the tax on Social Security and Medicare. So, Chris, when you get a paycheck, you'll see that there's a chunk in there for Medicare, Social Security. That's not going away. And it does limit this to traditionally tipped industries. So you can't be like a lawyer or a doctor or an executive and all of a sudden be like, hey, we're paying people by tips and overtime now to circumvent this. That's not going to work.
Hold on. I have to ask you a question though. Are you telling me that most service industry people make less than 30K a year? Isn't that the tax threshold?
But Chris, you can actually make way more than 30K a year and not pay any federal income tax. So if you make 50 a year or something like, you're not going to pay a heck of a lot of tax, if anything. We can plug that in. Let's ask ChatGPT. Okay. We'll just do it live on the show and I'm going to voice dictate. If you're a waitress and you make $50,000 a year in the United States, will you pay any federal income tax?
I'm curious.
It says ChatGPT says if she's single, standard deduction is 14,000 and no other adjustments, then she'll have taxable income of 35 grand. So yeah, she'll pay a little bit of income, maybe 4 grand. Let's see what happens if she has 2 kids. So if a waitress 50 grand a year and then has 2 kids, then she's going to get a child tax credit of $2,000, which is also part of this big, beautiful bill. And the child tax credit is 4 grand, Chris, that she's going to actually owe no tax on that. Yeah. So if we're talking about a waitress making 50 grand a year with 2 kids, she already pays no tax. I guess that's how, when they do these calculations at Congress, they know in Congress, when they're thinking about passing these bills, they know that 40% of the people making tips like waitresses already don't pay any tax.
Yeah.
Right.
I wonder if they know that, because that seems to be who that would appeal to, right? The people who are on the lower wage spectrum and saying, hey, every penny counts. And so this means something to me if I'm saving a couple $100 or $1,000 a year. And if it turns out those people aren't actually getting a benefit from this bill, wonder how that would make them feel about this bill that they may have voted for.
There's a question of whether the general public connects that. If you're waiting tables and you hear, hey, no tax on overtime and tips, right? You're probably super excited. And I think a lot of people don't understand how our tax system works, which is why it was brilliant when they started it which is, hey, you'll be taxed, but we're going to put all the burden on the employers. They take all of it out, and then you never actually feel the pain of paying it because your employer's withholding it all. And then at the end of the year, around tax time, or at the beginning of the next year, you get this thing called a tax refund. And you think that somehow you've won money when really what the government's doing is just paying you the money back. Most people aren't even, if they fill out their W-4 right, they're probably not even having federal income tax taken out of their check. It's likely just the Social Security and the Medicare. That's why the Republicans are thinking it's a big victory. It's like, hey, we've campaigned on no overtime and no tips. And it turns out that it doesn't actually cost the government anything. And we get a lot of political leverage from that passing. And Trump and the Republicans get to say that they kept a campaign promise, right? That's really what this is
And
about.
all that brings me back to why I don't follow politics. See, all that to bring us all back to a whole bunch of stuff that did nothing. Cool.
It did one thing, and this is why I was asking about the firefighters. And I think nobody's mad at. Yeah, nobody's mad about this because we all like firefighters. And if you're in a fire, you want one of these guys to pull you out of the fire. And there's not that many firefighters relatively speaking in the United States to the general population. So firefighters get a big win on this because they also had their union to go to work on it. And the deal was, you may know this, Chris, are like firefighters like 24 on, 24 off. Those guys actually work a lot of overtime. So the firefighters
I think it wasn't the 10 section that applied to them. So it had to be the overtime.
Of course, if you do pull me out of the fire, Mr. Fireman, if you're listening to this, I will gladly tip you if you pull me out of the fire, but you can win both ways. Although that's what firefighters traditionally tipped. Yeah, firefighters out there, all that overtime you work, you are going to win on this. Okay. You're going to avoid some federal income tax, and firefighters do typically pay income tax because they're paid decently well. So the firefighters win. That's how that works.
No.
There you go. There you go. Win for the firefighters. If you make over 160 grand a year, this is not going to help you anyway whatsoever. So I don't know if there are any highly paid bartenders out there, or if you're like a hairdresser. Are we supposed to call them anymore? A stylist? So some stylists can make a lot of money. So you're getting big tips. Maybe that's not a win. All right. We got to move on to the next section of this bill. And this is really what I think everyone is excited about if you're a homeowner. State and local tax deduction, SALT. Chris, you may know that you get to deduct 10 grand right now on your property tax. So if you own a home in Texas and you're taxed, let's say you're taxed 20 grand on your home in Texas, we have very high property taxes. Currently on your federal income tax return, you only get to deduct 10 grand. It did not used to be that way. You used to get everything. But that really made a lot of high tax states very mad, like Texas with property tax. But it really made the East Coast very mad and California, because they have high state income tax and they lost all of that deduction for their state income tax. For years now, the senators and House reps for these highly taxed states, they've been trying to get this SALT cap of the 10 grand increased. In this bill, it's going up to 40,000. So now, if you live in a state like Massachusetts and you've got state income tax of 40 grand, you're going to get to deduct the whole 40 grand. Or if you live in Texas in a large home and you've got a 20, 30 grand tax bill or an expensive home, you now get to deduct up to 40 grand. It gets phased out. I think if you make over 500 grand married filing jointly, I don't know if you're phased out to zero and you don't even get the 10. That would be bad, because at least now you're getting 10, but you don't get anything over the 10 if you make over 500. Side note, the standard deduction is about 30,000. So most people are not actually taking any itemized deductions. They're just taking the standard deduction from married filed jointly anyway. But if you do have a house that's somewhat expensive in Texas and you're paying 20 grand in property tax and you're paying a mortgage with decent mortgage interest, you're probably going to start going over that standard deduction pretty quickly. So this will benefit you. So this is the big piece of this. Does that make sense, Chris? Any question? I need a tax guy, but anyway.
Well, I am a tax guy. Actually, I find tax very interesting. We're not tax attorneys, but I do knowing the tax law. One of the things you and I certainly share is a healthy fear of the IRS. If I'm going to mess with anybody, it's not going to be the
Yeah.
IRS. I like knowing the rules and knowing which side of the rules to be on. So I think I remember when Trump did this in the beginning and some of the same party lines. Oh, the rich people don't need this. Oh, who cares if the rich are losing tax deductions? But I think the idea was I'm just going to simplify it. I'm just going to make this huge standard deduction. And then you don't need to worry about all this. But the other side of that is, as real estate attorneys, is what we see is, okay, but you do still need people buying multi-million dollar homes. Okay. We don't need to shed a tear for those people, but economies work when builders are building multi-million dollar homes, when contractors are hiring people to build multi-million dollar homes, and then people are buying multi-million dollar homes. It's how our economy works. So you don't want to suddenly disincentivize that.
Yeah, for sure. And when the cap was lower, when a cap was placed on it to 10 grand, it did sting high value homeowners for sure. All right, we got to move on to some other kind of 2 or 3 other items in this big beautiful bill because it is a big beautiful bill. QBI, qualified business income deduction. If you're a business owner, if you own a pass-through entity, this applies to you. And for several years now, we've been getting about a 20% deduction off business income, with the exception of highly paid professional services. If you're a lawyer or doctor and you make about over 400 grand in income, and maybe I think that's gone up 483 for joint filers, you don't get this deduction. But most small business owners, this is now going to stay. You don't have to worry about this. And this is a big cost. This is a big cost to our tax revenue in the United States. But that's staying. If you're out there, you own a small business and you're getting pass through income, you're going to maintain this QBI deduction and it's going to be at about 23%. So good for small business owners, good for everybody doing that. That's good news. And then finally, related to 2017 tax cuts, there were just some tax cuts when Trump got passed when he got into office. Those have now been made permanent, and that just secures lower individual income tax rates. Finally, the big thing out there, I think, for regular people, talking about child tax credits. Chris, are you familiar with child tax credits?
I am.
Okay. They're a hotly debated topic because we want to encourage and incentivize people to have children. Children are expensive. So we've historically in this country, we've given people child tax credits. They've been about $1,000, but I think as part of the 2017 tax cuts, we increased it to $2,000, doubled that credit, or at some point we did that. And that was gonna phase out if we didn't pass this big, beautiful bill. And so good news, it's now going to stay at $2,000. If you're a high income owner, you don't get, this does get phased out. It's, I don't know exactly what the phase out number is, but it's fairly low. But most people that are whatever it is, 100 grand a year, they're getting the full benefit, I think, of this 2 grand. There's been some, I think, rumors of abuse because a lot of people that don't have any earned income would get this credit and they would actually get paid by the government. Does that make sense? So you could have no earned income.
How would you do that? It's like, I would just think it would offset and the government would say, no, we're not going to cut you a check. You would just offset any liability. But if you don't have any liability, we're not going to cut you a check.
Your true colors come out, Chris, because if you were a real bleeding heart liberal, you would say, no, everybody on welfare that's having children that's not working should be entitled to a child tax credit, and they should just get free money from the government. Okay, that's the kind of the Democrat sort of liberal position.
Isn't that what Trump wants too? I thought he wanted to pay $5,000 for people to have kids.
That's again one of his campaign promises. But once you get into the tax code and the legislation, you start to see really how the sausage is getting made. And the reality is the Republicans are favoring giving the $2,000 child tax credit to people that have earned income. That means you're actually out there working. You have wages or self-employment income. And they're saying in order to get, I don't know if it's the whole $2,000 or if it's just the additional 1,000, you have to have $2,500 in earned income. Chris, that's not too bad. We're asking people to work and make $2,500 a year to get $2,000. That's a good deal.
Sounds like a pretty good deal.
Yeah, the Democrats think it's too much. So, there you have it. All right, people, that is one big, beautiful bill passing the House. We're going to keep people updated. We're going to see how that gets, how is it going to pass the Senate? Is it going to go back? Is it going to be amended? How does this thing end up? We're going to update people when that happens. But it did pass a very big hurdle. That brings us to our next section. This is our legal question section. And then in the spirit of talking about death and King George dying, this sort of gave me the idea. Let's talk about what happens when you own an LLC. Just you're a small business owner. It's a closely held LLC. Maybe you have two members. One of the other members dies. Chris, what happens?
The other guy has to figure out a way to run the business. Hopefully there's processes in place in the organizational documents of the business that allow that person to continue on, or they call a meeting and they elect new people or put new people in place.
Yeah.
It's not usually super complicated, but it does create a bit of a strain. It creates more of a strain if you're the only person. And now no one has access to the bank accounts. Employees need to get paid. Vendors need to get paid. The doors need to stay open. It makes it a little tougher when there's only one person.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you've got a 2-member LLC and the other member passes away, and assuming the surviving member is active and the business is going to continue to operate, but what the guy who survives, what happens to the 50% interest? And the answer is you go to your operating agreement, and the operating agreement is going to have a special provisions. Usually in our standard operating agreement that we use at our firm, Chris, it's 14.02, death of a member. And the bottom line is this: if it's a 2-member LLC, the guy who survives, he has the option of buying the other 50% from the spouse or the heir or the beneficiaries in the will at fair market value. That's how we do it. We put 90 days on there. If the surviving member does not do that within 90 days, then the LLC is then obligated to purchase all of the members' interest back to the LLC. Now, at fair market value. So go to the operating agreement, read the operating agreement. The operating agreement is a contract between members. It doesn't have to be that way. There could be something else in your operating agreement. Chris, if no such clause exists, if they just have an oral kind of agreement, no operating agreement, that's where it's squarely in your realm of probate. You're going to have that membership interest go through the probate process and run through the will. Tell the listeners what that looks like, Chris, when you've got kind of an LLC interest going through the probate process.
Then you usually have to have somebody, once the representative of the estate's appointed, then they've got to work with the other members and figure out who's going to run things. And as you pointed out, law firms are a little different, but in regular business, you don't really want to be running the business with your former partner's wife who doesn't know anything about business. Now, law firms, you can't do that because they have to be owned by lawyers. So if you don't have a spouse that's a lawyer, I think doctors have some special provisions on that too. But it can get dicey when there's an argument over the valuation of the business, who really led the business, who was really in charge, who was really bringing the value to the business. Because a lot of times somebody dies and they're the guy bringing in all the money. The other guy's going to say, business isn't worth that much, so can't really shake me down for millions of dollars now that our business is tanking. It can get.
Yeah. The bottom line here is you really need to have an operating agreement that specifies death of a member and says what happens. If you don't, you're going to end up with Chris over in probate, and you don't want that because you do not want to be running a business with your former member's spouse who doesn't know anything about the business. That's not going to work too well. You're going to have to figure that out. And that's going to be a negotiation process, and the spouse is going to want way too much money for the interest. That's how it goes. Okay. That brings us to my favorite part of the show, rant and rave segment. And we're talking about car dealerships. Hot take, Chris. Do you have pretty good experiences with car dealerships when you take your car in to get serviced, or I don't know if you go to an independent shop. What do you do?
Sir, I drive a Toyota Corolla. It does not ever need service ever. It is 10 years old and it is running just fine.
Surely it needs an oil change at some point. Do you take?
I take it in once a year, one time a year for an oil change, and that's it.
Toyotas are really a beautiful machine. They just run. You could about put water in the gas tank and whiskey in the engine, and the thing would just run. It just starts every time. Beautiful machine the Japanese have made. But Chris, I have a Mercedes.
Yes. When I take it in, they do tell me to replace my cabin air filter and to replace my air filter. And I say, no, if I need that, I will go to Walmart and buy it. So not to demean any local proprietor of any business, but yes, they do always try to oversell you. I do always have to tell my wife, no, don't pay for this. Anytime they tell you that you need something, just let them write it down and bring it home. Don't ever agree. The car is going to make it home. If we need to do it, you come back, we'll look at it and decide if we need to. Because yes, they do always ask them.
I've got a Mercedes, Chris, and I want to get it serviced. I take it over to a Mercedes dealer in the Houston area. I actually tell my wife to do it. I said, honey, drop it off for an oil change. She drops it off for an oil change. The guy calls me, it's ready or whatever. And that'll be $450. And I'm like, wait a minute. It should be like $150 for a synthetic oil change, even at a Mercedes dealership. Is, oh, sir, we did the oil change. We did a 21-point inspection. We topped off all the fluids. And I'm like, what? I just dropped it off for an oil change. Chris, what if I said, I just paid the $450? Let's say I did not authorize you to do all that. Just charge me for the oil change. Where does that come out legally? Do you think they have the right to just say, hey, we did this to it?
If it wasn't authorized, then no. But I think where they get you is they say, and you want the full package, right? Or something really shady. And so you say, yeah, I want the full oil change. But then what they really mean is the $100 tire rotation, which is ridiculous. And then all that other stuff that they're going to tack onto your bill.
When you go to a dealership, you really need to say, okay, I'm authorizing the oil change. That's all I'm authorizing. Do not do anything else. I don't want the 21-point inspection. I don't want the fluids topped off. And I do not believe for a second the tech actually topped off my fluid. I should have been like, what fluids did you top off? I paid you for those. Or did you put more transmission fluid in? It's going to be, you know what it's going to say? We put the wiper fluid in. Yeah, we topped off the windshield, the windshield wiper cleaning fluid.
The whole jug cost $3 in Walmart.
We topped that off for you, and we gave you the 21. So, sir, that's an extra $350. It's a deceptive practice, and probably if you go to the Mercedes dealership and you just tell them I want the oil change, I wonder if they even want you back as a customer. I think it's a deceptive trade practice. Are we ever going to sue the Mercedes dealership over DTPA? Probably not. This is how they get away with it. I think it's really sneaky of them. It made me not want to take it back to that Mercedes dealership. Chris, I think you do it the right way. Tell them, hey, this is all I need. Be express with it. That's the best practice. Or they really are going to try to get you on all this stuff. Pretty upset about that. If you're out there and you're a mechanic and you're a listener to the show, I'm looking for a good independent mechanic for my Mercedes. Or if you know anybody, please let me know. That brings our show to a close. I've been your host, Phil Silverman. Chris Hield has been my co-host. Like us, follow us, review us wherever you get your podcast. And as a reminder, nothing in this show is to be considered legal advice or tax advice. And this has all been for entertainment purposes only. If you have a legal question, please email us at info@silblawfirm.com. That's INFO at silblawfirm.com. And tell us you want it publicly answered in the podcast. Everybody have a great rest of your week and weekend.